Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Conversations in Time podcast. So, over to the guys.
Hello, I'm John N.
And I'm Ian G.
So, welcome to another podcast, a What If podcast this time. So, Ian, what is the What If today?
So, the What If today is what if Great Britain and Northern Ireland, or Great Britain and Ireland, I stand corrected, had not joined the First World War or not declared war on Germany and had not joined France and Belgium in 1914 when the Germans attacked? What would have been?
It's an interesting concept. I don't have concept, but I mean, from our understanding, what we found out about the opening chapters of the First World War, Britain came close to definitely didn't want to join in with the hostilities. Didn't see any reason. There was I think they used the term no skin in the game when it came to the issues associated with the assassination of
It's hard.
France.
It's hard to imagine the Liberal government using terminology like that in 1940.
Well, no, obviously they wouldn't have said, we got no skin in the game, lads. But, there was a strong desire to stay out and ultimately try and become the mediator. I think that was one of the things that the government was trying to promote.
The mediator before borders were crossed and shots were fired. I think that's the thing. I don't think there was much.
Although even the bit, so that I suppose arguably the event which dragged Britain into the First World War was Germany. Well, not invading Belgium, but marching through Belgium was the straw that broke the camel's back, arguably, from a British perspective. But they, as I understand it from listening to other podcasts about the First World War, they were happy to let the Germans go through a small part of Belgium because they knew that was what they were going to do. Didn't want to get involved, but Germans didn't do that. They didn't cut through a small part of Belgium.
Well, the Germans didn't do that. Yeah, the Germans didn't do that because the Belgians didn't let them. I mean, so the Germany had to essentially neutralise the areas of Belgium they wished to use. And there's some large fortified cities, that they needed to either to encircle or attack to ensure that their flank wasn't exposed. So it was a full-on war, inverted commas, with Belgium before it was a full-on war with France. So
So I know we never, our podcasts aren't about the minutiae of why the what if occurred. It's ultimately we can broad brush it and say maybe Germany or Britain pressured Belgium into allowing Germany through that part of Belgium and, held their nose up to it so that it happened and we stayed out. And Belgium stayed out, I suppose, arguably, if it was a small enough part. But anyway, that isn't the purpose of the podcast to talk about that. It's to say we didn't join. So what happened after that? So in my mind, there's a few things that we can probably talk about. So one is obviously the outcome of the conflict without Britain being involved. And then there's the outcome in Britain of us not being involved, which in theory, or, in my view, includes things like society, the empire, and industrialisation. Those sorts of factors as to the First World War had an impact on all of those. And if we weren't in the First World War, then we could talk about, well, what do we think would have happened on them? I don't know about you, but that's sort of my thinking as to what we could focus on. Obviously, I'm hoping you've got other ideas as well.
Well, those are the main things we generally end up talking about. I think we, although we can take it as a fait accompli in our what if scenario that Britain's not involved, I think there are some red lines in Britain not being involved that could or could not be crossed. We need to have a look at. So Britain wouldn't just say to Germany, "Oh, we're not remotely interested. Crack on." That wouldn't happen. So there are some, what's the expression? Some rabbit holes we could go down that they could investigate that. We won't spend hours doing it, obviously, but yeah, So a couple of the obvious ones. Most of the obvious ones relate around the use of the German naval forces and what they would do. It's hard to imagine that Britain would allow the German Navy to go whizzing up and down the Straits of Dover, bombarding France, just look at it thinking, yeah, no problem here. So there would be some issues around that, whether the Germans would be happy and all the rest of it, and whether that would have knock-on effect somewhere else and all the rest of it. So, let's look at the usual stuff, which is the impact to society, the impact to politics, the impact to other countries, the impact to the I had a great expression. I just went straight in my head and disappeared. The path of time.
That when you get older.
Yeah, that wasn't it. But So if Britain, I suppose the obvious place to start is if Britain. So 1914, the late summer. I mean, we won't bother too much about why the war happened. You can go and Google it. We all know Serbians mobilised, the Russians didn't like it, they mobilised, Germany didn't like it, Austria-Hungary did that, and then suddenly the railways are all transporting thousands of troops around and you can't stop them, and once you've started, we can't stop and all the rest of it. So anyway, so the Germans have gone through Belgium within 2 or 3 weeks, and they're at France. Onwards they go, Britain's not going to get involved. What happens then? When the answer is...
No, go on.
I was going to say...
butt in like I usually do. So,
The answer is either it's much the same or it's different. I mean, it's hard to... I mean, the British Army had a significant input in the First World War, untraditionally, shall we say, because Britain generally didn't get involved in continental wars, but created a huge standing army. But even the British Expeditionary Force, because it was professional, 100,000 professional soldiers in 1914 had a big impact in the northern part of France. Yes, the Battle of the Marne, they stopped the German army in the Battle of the Marne, but then sort of the French were there as well. So, So the question is, would the Germans have been stopped northeast of Paris, 60 miles northeast of Paris as they were? I think the answer is probably not. So I think you're looking at a reasonable probability of a victory, not so much as anything else, because you got this professional force wouldn't have stopped the Germans and pushed them. So I mean, when I say stopped them, it was a bit like an immovable force hitting an immovable object being hit by an unstoppable force. You just force it somewhere else, destroying each other in the process. So that's kind of what happened. The BEF was not all but destroyed. There weren't many people in the BEF statistically. We're still knocking about in 1915 who were around in 1914. So, but they pushed it south, and where the bulk of the French army is there, and it all became a stalemate. I think there's the aspect of morale. France would be on its own, albeit its Russian allies were still on their side, but they're 800 miles away.
So I mean, one of the things I'm not, I'm hoping a bit more about this. Maybe this is where I should have done a bit more research. I don't know when did the Germans or the Russians start hostilities?
August 1914.
So it was pretty much
the end of. So it's that classic. There's this raft of books and films of this Edwardian summer. The best summer of 1914, and then war comes. But in actual fact, the summer was terrible. But it's this sort of the idyllic summer. The idyllic summer, idyllic for the upper middle class who are about doing nothing. But the idyllic summer, and then the terrible war. So it was the end of August, and then it was. But
the France-Germany shooting war was a few weeks before then.
Yes, no, it was more or less the eastern and western fronts. There was no. Yeah.
Oh, right. It was just one of those bits of information that I'd failed to obtain. So
and then it became a stalemate very quickly. I mean, think of the 1914.
People don't talk about the Russian front in the First World War, do they? I mean, I don't know.
Well, they do. It's all It's all contextualised around the Russian Revolution.
But that was a couple of years later, though, wasn't it?
Oh, it was 1917, obviously. But it ebbed and flowed. The Austro-Hungarian. I mean, go off on tangent. We'll come back very quickly. The Austro-Hungarian army was absolutely dreadful. More or less lost everything to the Russians until the Germans turned up. The part of the world they were fighting was not even with infantry, which essentially, in the cavalry, there was very little mechanization in the Eastern Front, but it was in a very boggy territory. When I say boggy, I don't just mean a couple of fields. I mean hundreds of miles of the Pripyat marshes and stuff. So it was difficult to make any advantage. However, that said, hundreds of thousands of troops on both sides were killed. But anyway, so coming back to we can look at the Eastern Front, but I think the bulk of it is around, or the bulk of what I think we'll be interested in is around the Western Front in France.
That's right. But I mean, France had a very large army. I know that Germany was, probably more mechanized than the French, but
not massively in the First War. There wasn't a huge amount, other than trucks and aircraft, which were much later in the war. There wasn't a huge amount of mechanization. As you say, the French had a really good army, but And he had some excellent weapons. The French 75.
But then it's probably fair to
cannons,
say that
75
even if the
millimeter.
BEF wasn't there then, that the French wouldn't necessarily have just capitulated, or that the Germans would have walked all
No,
all
but
over
there was
them. I think they would have slowed them down. I think the outcome of
the Germans.
First World War would have been different.
The Germans had this. I can't remember what the word in German is, but it's like basically mailed fist or armored fist, which became Blitzkrieg. Let's not get into Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg was that's how the Germans always fought. They always punched through and around their opponents for various reasons. They didn't have resources to fight long wars. They're a continental power. They didn't have access to external markets the way that other countries did, like France and Britain. So they had to win a war relatively quickly, otherwise it would fall into stalemate. And
So I'm just looking something up here, and there was something called the Schlieffen Plan.
the von Schlieffen Plan, which was a left hook round the back of Paris to encircle Paris.
Mm.
And if you look at the von Schlieffen Plan and you look at the Blitzkrieg through the Ardennes in 1940, spot the difference. And if you look at the Franco-Prussian War, which was of which I know virtually nothing, but again it was an encirclement of Paris. They're all the same. It's reinforcing success. It's punching through lines, causing panic and despair. And I think, so you can have the biggest army in the world, but if your capital's encircled and surrounded, and the politicians make a truce, the biggest army in the world have no. You can't.
No, that's right. So
1 million troops can't all be in Paris.
So one of the things that the Germans weren't trying to do they're not trying to take over France. I mean, all right, they're at war with France, and then they'll want, say there's a truce, and then there's some negotiated settlement.
Yeah.
Germany's not going to start saying, well, we won all of France, and, the Kaiser now rules France. I think that they would have, there was territory that was lost during the Franco-Prussian War.
Yeah, France
they
lost
will-
that. The Germans had that already.
No, sorry, you're right. It's the wrong way around.
Yeah. So
I'm not
So,
sure
yeah.
what the German objective
well,
in terms of, okay, they've beaten France, because let's make that assumption that France would.
Well, the German objective ultimately is to defeat France, and you can argue that because they weren't really suffering under the delusions of racism and nonsense that the Nazis had, they would have probably said, right, we beat you now. That'll teach you a lesson. That had taken various things, booty, shall we say, and then left. I mean, I'm not saying they would have left within 3 days or 3 weeks.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it wouldn't have been the the view of the Second World War. Whereas I want to control these people because I've got this political view that I believe to be we're superior to everybody else. Blah blah blah. It's difficult to imagine they would do that. Having said that, they would have probably insisted on the destruction of fortifications.
Yeah, the de-arming of troops.
Well, certainly, or a demilitarized zone 50 miles from the German border so that they could come rampage. Not so much the fear of the French coming to, so that they could come and do, if the France were to do something they didn't like, they could come back in and very quickly say, right, well, we told you shouldn't do this, and here we are in Paris again. What are you up to?
Yeah.
Germany
didn't have any empire type aspirations. They weren't going to try and get French territory somewhere else.
In Europe, all
the Caribbean or Africa or stuff like that.
They did have by currently standards quite an extensive empire, but it was without getting the league tables, it was significantly smaller than.
No, that's what I mean. So they wouldn't have
but-
been trying to play for that, in terms of, okay, these colonies are now, like happened between France and Britain. That was a regular occurrence, wasn't it?
Or Japan and the European countries in the Civil War. No, I don't think that. It was essentially the reason they fought the First World War was in support of their allies, the Austro-Hungarians. So they knocked France out of the war. Then you can turn your attention to help the Austro-Hungarians against the Russians, and you knock Russia out of the war, and you think, right, okay,
Well, so that's the likelihood then. So we're going to make the assumption that Germany would have beaten France.
I think so.
Western.
I mean, arguably,
That's the view of a lot of people
they almost beat
Britain
France.
made that difference.
Yeah, they almost beat France and Britain as it was. And without the British naval blockade, which impoverished the country, they almost beat France and Britain and America in 1918, debatably. But then they ran out of steam. because their economy couldn't withstand it, and they were taking far too many casualties and all the rest of it, and couldn't replace them, and couldn't replace all the losses, blah blah blah. So I think I wouldn't say there's no doubt.
There's a higher probability.
Yeah, that they would have, the von Schlieffen plan would have worked, and we would have encircled Paris, and as in the 200 years previously, an accommodation would have come into place, a change of government, a demilitarized zone, knockdown. They were still into fortifications were still seen in those days as important. So no fortifications like the later Maginot Line, but that didn't exist obviously then. But nothing of that nature allowed, so that we can come around paging on your country every time you do something you don't like. But that said, the French could probably keep their honour.
Yeah, ultimately, it was only, even the French and the Germans didn't want to have this war. There's no doubt about that. It's only because of the treaties they'd signed, and it couldn't seem to back out of it. It was, it's different to the Second World War, completely different.
Yeah.
So I think you're right. Is that it's.
So I suppose the obvious question is what would that do going forward to Germany, France, and I think Britain becomes almost an irrelevance. I don't think.
Well, we'll come back to that. Let's just concentrate. So the First World War on the Western Front would have been a lot quicker. Would have finished a lot sooner with a German victory. That's our assumption. That's where we're going with this. We can put some timescales on how long that would take, but it certainly won't be as quick as the capitulation in the Second World War. It would have been. I think it would have been longer. I think the French would have provided some level of resistance, but it would have ultimately given in. Now, if that would have happened, there would have been a negotiated settlement, like you say. Then Germany would have redirected its forces back to the Eastern Front, and now we can talk about the Eastern Front in terms of what happened there. I mean, that got to a stalemate pretty quick as well. I know that you were saying that they're fighting in these marshes.
Yes, I mean,
pretty horrible going, and it's difficult to make advances or retreats, and all this sort of.
I mean, the name flitted through my head, but there was a big battle that the Germans won at great cost, which blunted which was a Russian advance, but it was a Russian advance that they blunted. Both sides lost ludicrous sums of troops, but that was the end of the Russian in terms of any future it almost out there. The Nazis used to venerate it as Battle of something or other. I can't remember what it was, but it was well east of Prussia. So the Russians were not really a threat, but the question is how would the Germans beat them? So the Germans were slowly advancing, but nobody fought in those days in that part of the world in the winter. So there was a sort of winter truce, isn't quite the right word, but there was a winter.
They just stopped, weren't they?
Yeah, we won't attack you if you don't attack us. Unwritten. The Austro-Hungarians were essentially useless, but had the advantage of mass. They had plenty of troops to call upon of half a dozen different nationalities as they are now. So the divisions, the 500,000 men in France could be deployed to Russia. But again, I think Russia would have been in the same state as it was. It would be crumbling, revolutionary. So I think
there's a big question about the revolution, isn't there? So I mean, if we're talking, we have to make some sort of decision, between ourselves as to, okay, so France lasts a year, say it's 12 months before the Germans can redeploy forces to the Eastern Front. I mean, we could make it longer, make it 2 years, So 1916.
Well, I don't think it would be 2 years. I just don't.
Well, between 1 and 2 years then. Right?
Well, I think France potentially would have capitulated in early 1915.
Okay,
but it's academic to some extent.
But what I'm saying is that it's middle of 1915.
Yeah,
right. They start redeploying troops to the Eastern Front against the Russians. So by the end of that year, so when you get to the winter and then there's the stalemate, because like you say, they're not going to fight when it's winter, particularly not in Russia. It just grinds to a halt. So in the winter of 2015, early 2016, there'll be a lot of German troops there. They won't be doing much because of the conditions, but then 2016 would have then become quite a pivotal year within that conflict, on that front. But the Germans that front would have had a significant difference in terms of the manpower on the German Austro-Hungarian side, wouldn't it, from what happened? There'd have been a lot more troops on their side, whereas the Russians would have still only had what they had in the real world.
Yeah.
So, again, it comes down to, okay, so how far? So we're talking about 2015 now. I don't know what the state of Russia is. It was obviously pretty bad because, like you say, revolutionary things were still going on. But you could almost get to the point where prior to, some sort of settlement, because I don't think Germany was going to they weren't going to try and advance to Moscow, were they? I mean, they just wanted to defeat the Russian army and
No, but they
have a truce, or have a settlement.
but then the interesting
they hadn't got any territorial, objectives.
No, but they might not at the start. But then once you start a war, you sometimes think, well, if we can beat them here, we can beat them there. I actually don't think the timeline would have been much different from what actually happened. It might have been, as I said, the Russian army was badly equipped. It was mutinous, even though it hadn't revolted. It was mutinous. So the only thing saving Russia, which was to a certain extent true later, was the distances. If the Germans wanted to go to Moscow, they probably could have done. Whether they could have come back again is another story. But I think the timeline would have been similar, but different dates. So I think the Russian Revolution would still have happened. Bear in mind, the Germans encouraged that. I mean, Lenin was in exile.
No, they did, but then if they did, I mean, I slightly disagree because I think that timelines would have been slightly different and they would have been in advance of.
Sorry, that's really what I meant. What I meant to say was the flow of the events would have been the same. They would have just been a year earlier.
But I think that if it was over, right? So there wasn't any conflict, you'd still have all of the issues in Russia, but would but that's the point. I mean, I don't think it would. But you've got Lenin and whatever in Switzerland, and then you only got to Russia because the Germans essentially sent him there.
Yeah.
Whereas if the conflict's over, what do they care?
Yeah, but why is it over? Well, I don't think the conflict is over. I think
I think it would be over earlier than 1917. It's just my.
That makes sense because you've got 60 odd divisions that you're which is an unimaginable number of soldiers in modern day context. But so it's possible. But then that doesn't stop the Russians themselves wanting things.
No, so I still think there would have been some form of.
Lenin was just
revolution
a figurehead. I mean, he wasn't.
No, I know he was, but so arguably he may not have gone back to Russia, or
well, he might have eventually. But there was Trotsky and Stalin and various other people whose names escape me. But
who weren't in Switzerland, who were actually
exactly. Well, exactly.
Yeah. So there were the two revolutions in Russia. So I mean, and there's always a what if, and I think we've got that on our list is about the February Revolution not failing. I mean, what would have happened rather than it failing and then the October Revolution, which was the communist one, taking part. So, like you say, there was significant upset in Russia. So there was always going to be a revolution of sorts. It's whether it would have been a communist-led revolution or whether it would have been some other type of revolution. I mean, like I say, we're going to do a what if on that, and that.
Well, yeah. I mean, just my couple of sentence thoughts on that is that the sailors who revolted at Kronstadt and Leningrad and stuff, probably most of them had never heard of Lenin, so they were just revolting.
No, that's right. I mean, there was
so they were revolting, and then people take advantage of a revolt. I think the people who take advantage of a revolt are still there, or whatever happens to the First World War, if you see what I mean. Whatever happens, Germany beats whoever. The Lenins and Trotskys, Lenin perhaps not, he's in Switzerland, but
but one of the reasons that exacerbated the problems was that the fact that they were fighting the Germans and a lot of money was being spent on the army, whereas if the conflict's over, you're not spending that money on the army. I mean, I'm not saying that there wouldn't be a revolt, but, there would have been an element of, there's a difference. The troops would still have done what they did, but like I said, it's that one's...
Well, okay, but
let's assume it carries on then. So,
I think that's...
we both agree there would have been a revolution.
I think what's actually the most interesting aspect of this what if, we haven't actually mentioned, so I'll put it out there. I think there's two things, is what would have happened to France and what would have happened to Germany. I think those are the interesting what ifs. I mean, So
Russia, we'll leave Russia for now.
Yeah.
The conflict would have ended earlier, but they still would have had the revolution.
So France in the early 1900s was a very febrile place as well. there was lots of anarchists. The term anarchy.
Yeah.
Anarchists. There wasn't communists yet, but they were essentially they were communists, but they didn't know that they didn't call themselves that. And France, all through the early 20th century, was an uproar. It was having governments doing one thing, and then 3 years later failing, and then another government doing something else. I think had they been defeated, and Germany will come on to some of the obvious things about Germany, but had they been defeated in 1916, they would have had a Pétain, a turncoat leader as such that they had in the Second World War, a puppet. They would have had somebody, but he would have been some sort of extremist. He would have had to have been one way or the other. I think France would have been in a very strange place.
Oh yeah.
I agree. From 1916 to 19 whatever. Whether they would have, so the Russian Revolution could have, not literally the Russian Revolution, but the Communist Revolution could have easily been in France. It was febrile. It was there already. There were riots between different.
It was, but it would have been a different type of. Well, you could. You're almost sort of suggesting that there could have been significant changes in the way that the government's run, which at the end of the day could have ended up in some sort of civil war within France.
Well, indeed, yeah.
Because we're not talking about the communists getting rid of a monarch, because that's already happened.
Well, that's a good point. So yeah, so I mean, you could argue that 15 years later, what was the Spanish Civil War could have been the French Civil War.
Yeah,
very similar countries in a lot of ways. France is more industrialized. But
that's probably a better analysis.
Yeah, no, that's right. So.
No, I think, like I say, France would have been in turmoil, and the opportunity for a civil war. I feel talking that through, that seems like a more likely outcome.
And who would have been the two sides? Well, it wouldn't have been Republicans and monarchists like it was in Spain. It would have been the left and the right. The right would have been most of the middle class, army, very big army, a lot of army officers, some troops loyal to them. The opposing sides would have been workers, communes, communists. Communist comes from communes, which is a French word, obviously. The bulk of the army not being middle class soldiers. Middle class officers being soldiers. That would have been you've got two armed camps there. You've got two opposing views. You've got government in turmoil all the time. You've got a national humiliation. And if you take the word Russia and put that in front of it, you say, the Russian Revolution. If you put the word France in, well, it didn't happen, but it could have happened. And then you've got Britain sitting 20 miles away thinking, Jesus, look at the state of them over there.
And we didn't join them the war.
And perhaps if we had, they wouldn't have got defeated, etc.
Well,
yeah. So where would that have finished? Well, who knows? But the question is, we know where it finished in Russia because we can follow the existing timeline. But and obviously Russia was impacted by external bodies. So the next question is, what happens in Germany? Well, you think of Germany, there's no stab in the back myth. The Nazi stab in the back myth where the German army was never defeated, but it was stabbed in the back by politicians, which is bullshit anyway, because the German army was defeated, significantly defeated. But that wouldn't have happened because there wasn't a stab in the back because it was never defeated. So there's always been a vein of nationalism in Germany, but the Nazi National Socialist stab in the back myth, and we were all betrayed, and it was all Jews and all the rest of it. That wouldn't have been there. So Nazism probably wouldn't have happened. Yeah, I don't know. It would have.
Well, no, but I think you're skipping ahead a bit far on that one. I mean, so first off, what would have happened in Germany would have been they were industrialising, so they would have become.
Yeah, but they weren't industrialising. They were already the.
Well, they were about. I think they were equal. It's based on economic.
Well, exactly. So they weren't industrialising as such.
But they would have become a very strong industrial nation in the early 20th century. Yeah, more so than.
Well, the question is, would they have been? Well, they were overtaking Britain anyway, but would they become as big as America? Possibly, but then.
Well, who knows? I mean,
But most
all I'm saying is that first off, that there would have been a lot of stability. Germany would have been probably basking in its own success.
Yeah.
The Kaiser would have still been seen as some sort of. I know that from a democratic perspective, he didn't have that much power. I mean, he had more power than the British monarchy, but he didn't have that much. He didn't have. He couldn't tell people what to do. There's still a government.
Influence, as they say, wasn't it? Yeah.
That's right. He had more influence over policy than the British monarch. But so the Kaiser would have stayed as a. Because after the First World War, I can't remember what happens to the Kaiser. He steps down, doesn't he? Resigns.
And he's exiled to the Netherlands. and dies in
Yeah.
1940, 1930.
So that means, because this is another interesting thing for me about what would have happened in Europe, because one of the outcomes of the First World War, we're going off at a tangent at the minute, so you have to drag us back.
Perish the thought, but yeah, it's
come to a T junction. Eh?
well, the whole conversation is nothing but a series. But anyway, carry on. Yeah,
It's something
as it always is. As it always is.
Yeah, it's something that sort of fascinates me a little bit about before the First World War and after the First World War. And part of that is that there were a lot of countries where the map got redrawn after the First World War. And is that still the case? And a lot of monarchs disappeared.
Well, but most of them, not all of them, but most of that is under the fall of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, isn't it?
That's right, but it would
Poland, Yugoslavia.
It wouldn't have fallen.
Well, no, but then
So you still have these small,
it had
little
massive
countries
tensions.
with kings and
It's a whole other conversation, but it had massive.
oh, it is, and I think that that's something worth squirreling away to even talk about that, because I think that's another tangent as part of what we're talking about, because that isn't the purpose of this. So we'll come back to that one maybe, and if people are listening, and they think that would be interesting, let us know.
Just to keep in that theme a wee bit, is the German state of 1900 to 1918 in the current timeline had no great ambition to create a Lebensraum, a living room to take. It didn't have a racist opinion at a state level of the Slavs. It didn't have a racist opinion at a state level of the Jews. And that's to say there wasn't racism like any other country, but there was racism in Germany like everywhere else. But the state didn't have those as official policy. So I don't see it looking around, if it wins the First World War relatively easily, in the context of the impact to its economy and stuff. It doesn't then think, oh, right, okay, that was easy, well, let's invade somewhere else. Because the Austro-Hungarians have got many of the lands that they're interested in, so they don't need to, they can come to some economic arrangement where we'll sell you this, and can we send some people to help you in industry and all of it. So I think it becomes relatively quiet.
No, I agree.
German sense, but France is the unknown, isn't it?
Yeah, France is the unknown. One of the other ones, and we won't talk about it, but I'm going to mention it, is Austro-Hungary. The Habsburg Empire.
Yep.
And what would have happened to that? But we can come back. I think that's part.
I think that's got a limited shelf life, but
it would have been, it would have been all about Germany, not about Austro-Hungary, the Habsburgs.
But that's the conversation about 1930, how the Germans come and help the Austro-Hungarians not fall apart. But that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah.
But
France is into. So I think France is in turmoil.
But just going back to the classic one, no Hitler. I'm not saying he's a corporal in some Bavarian,
painting his landscapes.
Well, a Bavarian regiment doing a bit of peacekeeping in Alsace-Lorraine and gets sent home eventually to be some arsehole in wherever he comes from, Vienna. And you're right, doing some painting and then being a sad man looking for his second ball in the Albert Hall, etc., etc. Yeah.
Hitler has only got anyway. Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. But but I think that's fascinating itself. No Hitler, no Nazis. Yes, there'll be a rump of National Socialists in general. There's a rump of racist people in every country, who vote.
Yeah, it doesn't mean to say there wouldn't at some point be another European conflict, but it wouldn't have been triggered by the Nazis. I think that's...
No, it would have been triggered ultimately, taken forward as what happens in Russia. If we think Russia still has a revolution, that really, it has its civil war for 5 years or 5 years. It tries its hand in Finland and Poland. Poland gets knocked back in the early 20s. But then, Stalin's still going to be there in the 30s and 40s. Still got a big army, albeit untested and all the rest of it. The Germans are looking at this big army thinking...
But did the Russians have a massive, land grabbing...
Yes, they did.
They tried it at that time.
Yes, they did. They tried to take Poland back in the early 1920s and failed. So, and that Lenin back. Yes. Well, yeah. Lenin was the premier. Whether he was actively involved, he
was a dictator, so
he must have signed off on it. He signed off on it. But whether it was his idea, or they were still fighting the White Russians at that point in the Far East and around the Black Sea and stuff. It was chaos. I mean, we've all seen Dr. Zhivago 100 times on the BBC. It was chaos for 5 or 6, 7, 8 years. So to one degree or another, albeit sort of country was settled, but impoverished by the civil war. But that's the existing timeline, and a new timeline would be, I think, would be very similar. So Russia's a threat, as it was to the Germans in 1930, but the threats to who? Not to Hitler, because he wouldn't have come to power. So there's that. But I think again that's another rabbit hole. I think the main thing is France, and France. I think France falls into revolution. I think France becomes, as to a certain extent.
Well, the only thing is when you say revolution, that suggests that somebody is
like civil war.
in power. Yeah,
no, you're right. You said civil war earlier, and I think that's a better. That's probably the more likely thing. And who wins that war? Well, who knows? You can toss a coin.
Yeah.
Is it the right wing or the left wing? The bottom line is France is out of the game as a global power for 20 years. No country has a civil war and becomes a prosperous.
You could almost see the case for France at some point. I was saying that there would be another continental war, and it could be initiated by somebody in France. So rather than a Hitler type in Germany, it could have been a French equivalent. Somebody who sees the
Well, that's true.
France becomes unified. Then
no, that's great, John. No, that is great, because does France get the stab in the back myth?
Mm.
And there's plenty of racist and anti-Semitic. Look at the Dreyfus Affair, which is a series of books and good films, and the rest of it. Lots of anti-Semitic sentiment in France. Does France become the Germans as what is So maybe there isn't even civil war. Maybe there's just a lot of thuggery and minor.
You could almost see, say the communists prevail, in France. Well, they're obviously going to be, and they get support from Russia as part of that internal conflict within France. You could then see, France then wanting to attack Germany.
But the thing we've forgotten is the reason that Britain and France in the original time appeased Germany was because of the disaster of the First World War and the million and a bit dead French and 800,000 dead British. Never happened again. Or the terminal, so there was no. Germany wouldn't sit back, having not been through that experience, and maybe they wouldn't care anyway. But having not been through that experience, having won the war with relatively little casualties, which by modern terms would have been appalling, but by what actually really happened, limited casualties, they wouldn't sit back and let France fall to pieces and become a threat again. So it's interesting. It's you could postulate that France could have a civil war, or could have a strong man come to power, or a maniac.
I think that's likely. I think because that's that normal.
Yeah, but what would Germany think of that? What would Germany think of that?
Well, yeah, but I suppose it depends on what else is happening in terms of what's.
Well, yeah, indeed.
For them, maybe they just see it as it's just the French. They're not causing us any problems.
Just on their border. I mean, and you've got some guy. It didn't take long for Hitler. As soon as he started demonising the Jews, and he'd got that under his belt, to then start looking around. So if you had a French equivalent, and the French army was still intact, but albeit.
But the Germans might see it more as at least as some stabilised something. Don't forget, Germany didn't have this civil war type thing.
Well,
different type of. Well, it did, but it wasn't.
Well, it didn't have a civil war. You're right, but there was the Rosa Luxemburg, who was a sort of a left wing. There was great big punch ups in the streets, and there was Franco.
But our assumption was that France falls apart more. Falls apart, whereas Germany did
more in the Spanish model, where you've got little cities being attacked by other Spanish people who are in uniform with rifles and stuff, not just punch ups.
The Germans might be happy to have somebody who's going to stabilise that, because they don't want it overflowing into Germany.
Well, that's the American 1950s, 1960s view. You're better a strong man in power than a weak democracy, isn't it?
That's right.
But those generally aren't on your borders. I think Germany might intervene.
Well, I think they would have interfered. Absolutely, I think they picked somebody. They'd have picked a side and then probably supported it. Now, whether that would have been enough for them to then, because you get into this scenario, don't you, where you could have the Germans are essentially got what could be considered a puppet running France. You have another faction which wants to overthrow them, and then
but I think it would all be. It would have been the American model where they would support people and give them money and cheap weapons and the rest of it, they wouldn't necessarily have sent troops. If you think of the Americans,
No,
South
that's right.
American
Yeah, so
policy
they
of
would
the
have been-
60s.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it would have been
Yeah.
interesting.
But the elephant in the room is ultimately, and I think, is Russia, because Russia, we have accepted for the purposes of conversation that Russia would probably have progressed much as it had anyway. So Stalin would have come to power, and
Well, that's why I think that if there was some, if we look at it as in the Spanish sense, there were communists in the Spanish Civil War, weren't there?
yes,
Wasn't they?
well, they were called Republicans, but certainly
Didn't they get support from Russia?
they did.
Yeah. So if that was happening in France, then you'd assume that they would also get support from Russia. Let's face it, I can't see the Germans supporting the communists
No,
in France.
not even non-Nazi Germans. They're still nationalist Germans. They're still right wing by any definition, just not
That's right.
suicidal maniacs. But yeah, it's
So you could, in our sort of timeline, you could start seeing the early 30s is when there's a French Civil War that starts breaking up into a bigger conflict, because the Russians are seen.
well, but that didn't
unity.
happen in the existing timeline, and I suppose the question is why not? I suppose, and the answer is I don't know. Truth be told, I suppose the great powers,
Well, I thought,
inverted commas, made the decision to not let that happen.
and we're going to have to leave this for another podcast because we've already, this one's gone on.
Yeah, no, it's
Which is great because I think we could have our first time we could have a part two. Yeah, we haven't talked.
But I think ultimately
We haven't talked about the United States, but
in the end, the Russians dropped an atomic bomb in Berlin. I'm only joking a little bit. No, I think
I'm going to have to. It's funny. I'm going to have to listen back to this one because when we do it, because this will be the first time we do a second, a two-parter, which is great.
Yeah.
But we hadn't planned for it. So
yeah,
which is also.
Why don't we try and summarise where we think we've got? So obviously we think, going right back to the start, we think Germany would have defeated France relatively quickly, and that's the interpretation. I think the war in the East would have been much. Let's not worry about Italy and all.
Well, they've gone roughly the same.
They would have got roughly the same with perhaps shortened timelines. There would have still been a revolution of one form or another. And I think the Trotskyites, Leninites would have still taken power ultimately and become the Soviet Union, etc. So let's go all the way for that timeline, 1930s. Spot the difference in Russia. The question is around France. Would it be civil war? Would it be a strong man? Would it be the stab in the back myth? Would it be extreme nationalism? Call it what you like, or would it be a civil war along the Spanish lines? It's difficult to see. I mean, you can toss a coin and take your pick. The interesting thing, isn't it, that Britain becomes an irrelevance, which to a certain extent always has been in relation to continental Europe.
That's right. That's what he wanted, didn't want it?
Yeah. Well, does that have any impact? Well, it does ultimately if France turns.
It will. So this is where we'll go on our next sojourn into the counterfactual universe. In terms of let's start talking about Britain. Right. So let's pass through that.
So we need to write we need to write this down like we say at work, because I never remember it after the end of a meeting. We could arguably take it to the mid 1930s and say, right, Russia's, as per Stalin, a big threat. France is engulfed in
some system
war.
Yeah.
And what are the Germans and the British doing about it?
That's right. Yeah. The Germans, the Russians, and the British. That's ultimately where we're going to. Well, so that's where we are.
Yeah.
And then at the start of the next one, we'll talk about Britain and what impact not being in the First World War had, because it would have been. I think it would have been a very different Britain in the 30s to what Britain was like in the 30s, regardless of what happened on continental Europe. So, on that lecture,
I was just going to say I agree, because all the things of which happened in the 30s are around the basis of the disaster of the First World War, weren't they?
That's right. So it's no. I think there'll be a.
But there's been a hell of a lot of food for thought there as well.
For me, I know we're into our second season now, and series. Sorry, season series. That this one's got there's a lot of juice in this one, and I'm hoping we have some more. If we can get some more listeners, we really want some feedback. We're talking a lot of rubbish, or interesting. What about this? Or almost certainly people. Let's face it, if we even get any public school educated historians, I'm sure they would scoff at And is that how they say it, scoff? Anyway.
Excuse me, look, I got my higher in
Not at a
history,
public school.
mostly, well, it was a public school. Any members of the public could go. But one of the major parts was the First World War, von Schlieffen. I remember that, the von Schlieffen plan.
Yeah.
Lots of fun shouting von Schlieffen at the top of your voice at the back of the class. Yeah, it's in the funny accent. Anyway,
Well, we didn't do that at school. So we did the Corn Laws, I think.
no, I did that. That was the O levels, but whatever. But yeah,
No, but I didn't do A-level history.
well, I didn't do A levels either. But let's not get into the different the differences in Scottish education.
So we should bring this
About
podcast,
SNP, but yeah.
yeah, we'll bring this podcast to a conclusion. Thanks everybody for listening. Hopefully you're keen to hear where we go next in this particular What If. I must admit I am. So I'm going to have to do a bit of thinking, a bit of reading, and we shall listen, or hopefully you'll hear from us very soon. So bye for now.
Bye.
That's it! Now we know you enjoyed that, or maybe you didn't. But why not let us know what you think? But you can go on Twitter, or X if that's the way you get dressed, and search for ORC_time to find us. On Facebook, simply search for Conversations in Time and leave your thoughts right there.